morning, everybody. We're at the customer's house this morning, getting ready to swap out the steering system. We're gonna do a helm. We're gonna do a cylinder on this 21 Mako. The day is beautiful. The sun is out. It's breezy. It's not too hot. I'm enjoying it. It's supposed to rain later today. Hopefully, I beat the rain and get it done before then. Shouldn't be a problem. But here we are. Bring you guys along. Alright, so the first thing I'll be doing is replacing the helm. I'm just kind of getting everything together here to get started. And I'll be removing the steering wheel cap in order to access the nut that holds the steering wheel to the shaft. And now I'll find the appropriate socket and get it on there. Remove that nut using an impact. And the steering wheel doesn't just come off of there. So a little trick that I like to use is to put a big screwdriver or a pry bar behind the steering wheel. Put the nut back on the end of the shaft, just hand tight there to protect threads. And with some pressure and a light tap on the shaft, the steering wheel pops loose. It's not always quite that easy, depending on how long the steering wheel's been there, and the material of the shaft and the rust. Then it may be a little bit harder, but this particular one wasn't so bad. Now I'm going to remove all the screws that are holding the helm cover in place in order to access the screws that bolt the helm to the console. So now with the helm cover removed, I've got access to the helm for removal. I'll start by removing the nuts on the back of those bolts that are holding it. They're 7/16 nuts, and there's 4 of them. So I'm removing them here. And now that they're all removed, the helm comes out. Nice and easy. Just kind of looking things over. Put it back in for line removal, which is coming up. Alright, so now we're looking at the back side of the helm. Put a catch pan just in case some oil drips, which it will. When you remove hydraulic lines, you're going to lose some oil.
So a little tip,
and I'm showing here
these couplers,
a fitting
as well. I got 2 of them with me.
coupler
But this coupler
to
right
couple
here,
the 2 lines together. So when you remove them off the helm, you can put them together
in this case I'm not. I'm gonna
and keep the hydraulic fluid in the lines essentially. And I just explained that if you're sending the helm away, it's a good way to keep contamination out of your lines and keep the fluid from leaking over time out of those lines. So, in this particular case, I didn't really have to use the coupler to put the lines together. I was just removing the helm and putting a new one right back in its place. But if you're sending it off, and it may take a few days or a week to send it off, get it repaired, and get it back, then it's a good idea to put the lines together. And I'm just kind of showing it here. Really, the reason I did it in this particular video is just to illustrate how to do it and the benefit. And there's some oil dripping, so that's why the catch pan is there. Just unthreading it, unthreading it. And there we are. Now I'll put them together. And as you can see, the lines are labeled. Um, one's green, one's red. And you'll see that on the cylinder end a little bit later in the video that they're also labeled. And that helps to keep track of where they belong on the helm and on the cylinder. And actually, fun fact is that they are crisscrossed. So the green goes on the starboard side of the helm, but it goes on the port side of the cylinder. So just a little tip there when dealing with hydraulic steering lines. And there they are, coupled together, and the helm's ready to come out. All right, so I'm getting the helm prepped for installation. I've got it unpackaged, and the little baggie there contains the hardware, the fittings for the lines that screw into the back of the helm. Got to remove these plugs that they ship with. And those plugs are Allen heads. I don't remember what size off the top of my head. It wasn't that one. Um, but yes, they are Allens. So I'll remove them, install the fitting. These fittings are adjustable. If you've never dealt with them, you can set them in the position where they need to be, and then you can tighten that nut that's visible there, um, to keep the fitting in that position. So it's not like a pipe thread fitting that has to go in tight, and you either tighten it more or you loosen it a little bit to get it in the position that you need. That lock nut will actually keep it in the position where you need it once you set it. And you'll see me tighten them up here in just a second once I've mimicked the position off of the old helm so that the lines come up nice and smooth. So see, cinch it a little bit, grab another wrench to hold the fitting in place, keep it from moving while I tighten down the lock nut. Just good and tight, not too tight, but definitely not too loose. Same thing on number two. And it looks like it's ready to go in. All right, so now I'm reinstalling the helm using the new hardware that was provided. These bolts that hold the helm to the console actually have the threaded bosses for the little screws that hold the cover in place. So you have to use the provided screws in order to be able to mount this cover. So that's what I'm doing now, putting all the little Allen screws back in place. There's 7 of them, if I remember correctly. 3 in the top and 4 in the bottom that I'm putting in now. And at some point, I connected hoses without filming it, so they're connected already in the back of the helm. The green hose went on the starboard fitting of the helm, and the red went on the port fitting of the helm. And for those of you that don't know, starboard would be the right side of the boat facing the bow, and the port would be the left side of the boat facing the bow. And here I'm just kind of showing the hardware, going over what I did. Replace the helm, replace all the hardware. Put the helm cover back on, and she's good to go.
On to phase 2, which is the cylinder. That part may get more interesting.
Now I'm getting ready to replace the cylinder on the engine. I've already kind of prepped the area. Put my pan down in case I lose fluid. And again, I'm removing hydraulic lines, so I'm gonna lose some fluid. Remove the nuts off of the bar that goes through the tilt tube. Those are 3/4 nuts. And then remove the nuts that hold the Z brackets to the rod in the hydraulic cylinder, and those are 5/8. Just use an impact to zip those off of there. And here the shaft tends to get a little stuck in those Z bars sometimes. A little bit of grease during reassembly goes a long way, and you'll see me grease those when I reassemble the new cylinder. But you'll get corrosion that builds up in between the rod and the little Z bracket, and that can sometimes cause issues during disassembly. I think it wasn't terribly bad here. I've had worse. I've had where a torch will be required. Have to hit it with an acetylene torch in order to get those brackets off for disassembly. It looks like I'm taking the bolt that holds the cylinder onto the engine off. Yep. And there went the cylinder. So now it's pretty much unattached from the engine. And the only thing left to remove is the bonding wire that's still attached to the engine there. 3/8 socket. Pull that bolt and remove that bonding wire. Didn't really need to replace it. The old bonding wire was fine, but the new cylinder comes with a new bonding wire, so I just went ahead and replaced it because why not? And that pretty much wraps up the removal of the old cylinder, and we'll cut to the installation of the new one. I'm getting ready to install the new cylinder, unpackaging the new bonding wire. And I take a little grease off that grease fitting and put it on the threads of the bolt. I like to grease um, pretty much everything when installing these hydraulic systems or these steering systems, even mechanical, um, just to help with future disassembly and trying to minimize corrosion getting into those threads. So a little bit of grease helps all those situations. And I'm not sure what I was saying there. And again, that's a 3/8 head on that bolt that attaches the bonding cable to the engine. Now I'm mounting the cylinder to the engine. And that bolt is a 3/8 fine thread with a 9/16 head. I'm getting it started there by hand. And on clean threads, they thread in fairly easily. Looks like I got it in far enough to get the nut started on the bottom side. And I like to do this before I get too much thread on the bottom, just so that nothing interferes. It's nice and easy. And I will hold the nut while I thread the bolt, and the nut's staying tight. So I'm not tightening two things separately. I'm almost tightening two things at once by holding the nut in place up against the underside of the bracket while threading the bolt through the bracket and through the nut at the same time. Just kind of helps speed things up a little bit. And I don't have to worry about tightening the nut with the spacing on the underside. It can get a little bit aggravating, I guess is the word. So just the way I like to do that. Guess I went and changed out wrenches. Sometimes, a 14 and a 9/16 are very close. And I probably had a 14 and it didn't quite fit. So I was having some difficulties. So I just went and swapped it out for the correct size. A little ratcheting wrench while holding that nut in place on the bottom until that bolt is tight. And then you'll see me tighten the nut the rest of the way once that bolt is good and tight. So now that the cylinder's mounted, I'm replacing this nut. And this nut's used to take the play out of the system when you put the shaft through the tilt tube. It's a little bit long once you fasten everything and the nuts are tight on the bracket. There's always a little bit of slack. So that nut is there to take that play out, and then you tighten that little hex bolt to keep it from turning. So I'm replacing that with the new one that comes with the cylinder. Nothing was wrong with the old one. It was actually loose. Um, but it's still a good idea to replace it. New system comes with a new one, so we throw it on there. And now I'm getting ready to put the shaft through the tilt tube. And again, always want to grease. If you don't grease that shaft when you put it in that tilt tube, over time you'll get buildup in there, and that shaft may get stuck. So grease helps to mitigate that a little bit and hopefully help in future disassembly. Now that I have the bar installed through the tilt tube, I'm going to add the spacers that go on either side of the tilt tube. There will be 3 plastic spacers and 2 metal washers. So you will place the 2 big spacers and the metal washer on the port side, and the thin spacer and 1 metal washer on the starboard side. So here I'm taking a little bit of grease off of the bar and putting it on the end of the cylinder rod. And that's again to just help lubricate and protect from corrosion, making that Z-bar difficult to remove in the future. And then I'll place the washer and nut on the end of the rod. And again, that's a 5/8 nut. And I'll place the nut on the end of the bar, which is a 3/4 nut. This will be repeated on the opposite side, except the spacers will be different. It'll be 1 small spacer and the metal washer. And the reason for this is because there are threads extending out of the starboard side of the tilt tube so that you can screw the nut on a cable onto that tube. The port side of the tilt tube doesn't have those threads extending out. So when you mount your cylinder, you're going to balance it by adding those extra washers to the port side. Here I'm just greasing the Z bracket for the opposite side and getting ready to install it and repeat the process, adding the 5/8 nut and washer to the rod in the cylinder, and then the 3/4 nut and washer to the end of the bar that goes through the tilt tube. And I will take the appropriate socket on my impact to tighten the nuts on the end of the rod in the cylinder, and also the nuts on the end of the bar that goes through the tilt tube. Now, to tighten the nuts on the bar going through the tilt tube, I do have a ratchet and socket on the other end, or it'll just sit there and spin inside that tilt tube. So you have to hold it, and they'll both tighten up until they bottom out, because there's still some slack, which I'm about to demonstrate how to take that out using that nut. So I'm backing it off until it tightens up the play in that bar and those brackets.
All the slack in here and in here, so it doesn't kind of bounce back and forth.
Now that the cylinder's mounted, I'm going to connect the lines and pay attention to the markings on the lines. One has the green and one has the red. And remember, at the helm, the green went on the starboard side and the red went on the port. But here at the cylinder, the green is going on the port fitting and the red's going on the starboard. With these front mounted hydraulic steering cylinders, you have to cross the lines. So again, green went on starboard at the helm, red went on port at the helm, and at the cylinder, the green went on the port and the red went on the starboard. If you do not install the lines correctly, then you will end up with a system that steers backwards, and that will leave a customer very confused. After installing the lines, I'm completing the installation by adding the grease fittings that thread into the Z brackets. Now, one thing that I didn't mention and that's not really visible in the angle is the bonding wire on the starboard side of the cylinder. It bonds between the cylinder rod and the grease fitting that I'm installing now. So just don't forget to finish that part of the installation. And you'll be able to see it in this final walk around of the installation as I come around to the starboard side. There is the bonding wire attached to the grease fitting and the end of the rod.
So for those of you that aren't familiar, new cylinders come with this set of hoses. One of them has a little cap for the bottle and threads for the helm. So you'll screw it in to the top of the helm and then attach your bottle and kind of feed it like an IV. And then this hose here will go in the back on a bleeder, depending on which way you've turned the engine. I'll kind of talk it through as I do it. I always have to look at the book to remind me which bleeder to open when I'm on which side. So I'll do that real quick and then talk it through as I do it. But Yeah, and as the fluids coming out of the as the fluids coming out of the cylinder, when you open the bleeder, you'll catch it in a clean bottle so that you can reuse it. Oh. And usually I'll do one bottle per bleeder, typically gets it. If it still feels squishy after I run a full bottle through each bleeder, then I'll do another through each bleeder, and that typically does it. But I'll run a full bottle through one bleeder, um, watching for air. Of course, air coming out dictates whether I need to keep going or not, really. But if it looks pretty clear of air, then I'll just finish that bottle, refill the bottle, and swap it to the other bleeder. And run another full bottle. That tube.
What I'm doing here is just filling the helm and kind of starting to fill the system. I'm just turning the wheel back and forth slowly, getting some of this fluid into the system. I'm not bleeding it by any means at this point. Just simply adding some oil to the system. Yes, we see some air coming back from the system through the helm and into the bottle, but this is not the proper way to bleed it. In just a few moments, I'll start going to the back and open the bleeders while I rotate the steering wheel to push fluid through and air out. And I'll explain that here in just a little bit. So here I'm actually bleeding the system now. I've turned the engine all the way to the right or to starboard, and I have opened that same side bleeder. You can see some air coming out of the cylinder and into the line while the engine is in this position and I have that bleeder open. I am slowly rotating the steering wheel counterclockwise or to the left in order to push that fluid through and push the air out of the system. And I will do this until my bottle is empty at the helm. I will keep an eye on that clear hose for the presence of air bubbles. If I don't see any, then I'm satisfied with one bottle running through that side. If I still see some at the end of the bottle, then I'll go ahead and run another whole bottle through that side of the system. And then I'll just repeat it on the opposite side, which you'll see here shortly. After I close this bleeder and move my hose over to the other side. So as you saw just a moment ago, I rotated the engine the opposite direction all the way to the left or to port. And now I've opened that left side bleeder, hooked my hose up and put it in the bottle. Now I'm rotating the steering wheel clockwise or to the right to push fluid through the system and push air out of the system. As we can see here in that clear hose, all that air getting pushed out. And same as with the other side, I'll run a whole bottle through it, monitoring the air bubbles in the clear hose. And if I'm satisfied with one bottle, I'll stop there. I believe this system and most systems usually they just take one bottle per side and they'll be fully filled and bled. So now I'll just finish off this bottle on this side, run the whole bottle through, and then come and close the bleeders, remove the hose, and just double check my system for any play, for any slop at the steering wheel. And if I feel that it's still sloppy, then I'll repeat the process on both sides again. So now with the bleeder closed and the hose out of the way, I'll move this bottle out of the way too so I don't spill a bunch of fluid everywhere. I'll go rotate the steering wheel, turn the engine, handful of times, lock to lock, and just see how it feels. Make sure that there's no rattling or ratcheting in the helm, which could indicate air. Um, Make sure that there's no slop or play in the steering wheel, which will also indicate air. You can see that those short, rapid movements, um, if there's air in the system, the the system won't be so responsive. So that's one way to know. Small, short rotations back and forth of the steering wheel. If the engine responds, then you're pretty much filled and bled properly. So we're good to go. And I was satisfied with how this one was responding. Now that I'm satisfied, I'll just give a quick wipe down of the cylinder around the bleeders. And then I'll put those little black caps that you can see by that Mako backing plate. I'll put those back on the bleeders, um, just to keep contamination out of them. Mud daubers will sometimes get in there and plug those things up with dirt, um, or corrosion can build up. So just protect your bleeders. Put the little boots back on to keep them clean. Quick double check of the bleeders with a socket never hurts. Make sure that they're good and tight. No oil leaks. And here shortly, I'll go through the rest of the system and double check for leaks and make sure everything's tight before I start cleaning up. So here I'm going to finish the helm, remove the bottle, remove the line. I like to leave the bottle hooked up and kind of try to put it as low as I possibly can. Let some of that fluid drain back into the bottle so that I minimize the amount of mess that I make. And that's what I'm doing here. So then I'll pull the bottle off and remove the hose, wipe up the area. So now with the hose out of the helm and all that out of the way, I'll put the plug back in the helm and wipe everything up. So I'll give the system one last check, as you'll see here. Just kind of rotate, make sure everything still looks okay to me. Now that I am satisfied, I put the cap on the steering wheel. Again, just double, triple check everything. You'll see me go underneath and take a look at the lines at the back of the helm, make sure there's no hydraulic leaks, make sure everything still looks good, no leaks from the fittings that I installed on in the helm, no leaks from the lines. Just again, double, triple check everything, make sure everything looks good with the system before I give it the final seal of approval and start cleaning up. Um, so that is that. Helm is in, cylinders on, filled and bled. Quick recap. Pulled all this stuff off, replaced it. Pulled all this stuff off, replaced it. Filled it, bled it. And this job is complete. So now I'll be cleaning up and calling it a wrap. Thank you very much for watching. Please leave a comment with any of your questions or any suggestions for improving videos or future videos. Thanks again.